How are you doing out there? I've just been told that the two previous speakers have used up my time, so I have to be very fast. And I'm bringing my own clock. And for those of you who are counting the time, tell me to shut up. I never thought I would ever be Minister for Education. Last March I got the job I wanted. Eamon Gilmore asked me 3.5 years ago to take on education in opposition. Everybody in this room, everybody in this island is an expert in education because they've gone to school. And they have a PhD when they send their children to school. Which makes me a qualified surgeon because I have my appendix out. But in opposition, touring the landscape, meeting the practitioners, meeting the interest groups, seeing beyond the familiar experience that we all have, good, bad or indifferent, I learned an awful lot. And I'm still learning. And most of what I learned is positive. And the most positive thing about it, there is a hunger for change within the educational environment, driven probably by three things. They know the system is full of committed people, but its outcomes are not satisfactory. They know, and I'll return to what you said, Breen, and in a separate way, Mary, to what you said, but in relation to the point system and the interface between the second level curriculum. And they know that we can't go back to the old days of betting on horses and going to the Galway races and pretending that we're making wealth by selling houses to each other that nobody wants to live in, and we call them ghost estates today. We're going to get out of this the same way our grandparents got out of it, and that's by education. And we have to make ourselves fit for purpose in the beginning of the 21st century. But I want to go back to the tradition that informs this country, because I'm part of that tradition in the sense that I grew up in a house that revered education. Yes, it was a devout Catholic household, as it was for many of you in this thing, but the real God was education. He was the God. I'm one of 5 boys and 1 sister. And as she kept her good looks and the rest of us lost our hair, she ratcheted it down from being the senior member of the family to being second youngest. And as 5 boys growing up in a middle-class family, who were the first time in Dublin, my father grew up in Liverpool. And we were fortunate. I've no horror story to tell. There's no Angela's ashes here. But there were 2 parents who had never gone to university and who wanted above everything else their children to go to university. And as a boy, and I was a boy, still am, we could do anything we liked at home. The domestic rules were, get your exams and whatever else you do, don't get caught and don't bring it home. That was the kind of the kind of culture. Where did this come from? And the history, you know, is interesting. I am a history buff. This coming October, 180 years ago, a man called the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Sir Edward Stanley, issued a letter that laid the foundations for the Irish primary education system. Very few other countries in Europe had it. And the other island of the United Kingdom didn't have it at all. And within decades, that system, for those of you who have seen that play Translations, and I know Brian Friel has been celebrated by this summer school, we had an education system before many others. And the call to teaching, or to training, and the learning, and the master, and all of that, has it so infused itself into our culture that it is embedded. We take it as part of our DNA. Other countries don't have it. We have a reverence for learning that we can now remobilize. And I want to try and remobilize that. And Joe, when you're still here in 20 years' time, celebrating the bicentenary of the Stanley Letter and the primary education system, maybe you might devote its theme to how well we have done in 200 years. I see us having 7 challenges facing us. I'm grouping a lot of things together. 7 challenges, and I'll call them out to you. The demographic challenge, the equality challenge, the curriculum challenge, the planning challenge, the technology challenge, the economic challenge, and finally, the international challenge. And let me just tell you the demographic challenge. Now, I have a paper. I've written the paper myself, which means I can extemporize it with some degree of recall. In round figures, we have 1 million young people in permanent full-time education, not to count the teachers and everybody else. 1 million. Within 5 to 7 years, that will increase by 10%. No other country in Europe is facing the challenge. It is unprecedented. I announced recently, and this is scared the bejesus out of the guys in Tullamore, we have to build in the next 4 years, or start building, 40 new schools. 20 of them post-primary schools that will cater for 1,000 pupils each, and 20 of them primary schools that will cater for something of the order of 600 pupils. We have never been here before. One of my predecessors, Mary Hannafin, very nearly crashed, and the system with her, because they didn't know how to calculate the numbers. We now do. We have a GIS system, a geographic information system, that knows where every payment, child benefit payment, is located for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And at year 4, they're knocking on the door to get into a primary school. So we now know the scale of the problem, and it is enormous. So we are facing, like nobody else has faced in the whole of Europe. Most other countries in Northern Ireland, up the road, they're talking about a declining population. One of my predecessors, Niamh Bhreathnach, published a white paper in the 1990s that talked about the challenge facing primary education was the decline in population. It has reversed. Challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is the equality challenge. This country is a deeply, deeply unequal society. Privilege and power that comes with it, and money that sustains it, is unequally distributed in this country. And many, but not all, of the people who possess, from a minority point of view, that incredible possession, use their power, privilege and money to ensure that their children, who may not be as bright as them, that they can buy the educational access that will ensure the maintenance of privilege and power within that family. I believe that education is the anvil of equality in our society, and that numeracy and literacy are the hammer and tongue that will deliver it. And we have to deal with that basic requirement that people who go to our school systems emerge with one fundamental, or two fundamental things, two sides of the same coin. You go to school to learn to read so that you can read to learn. I'll repeat. You go to school to learn to read so that you can read to learn. Now, when children are born, we presume that talent and ambition and ability is equally distributed across the system. We have no knowledge to suspect otherwise. But the educationalists tell us that within a very short period of time, when the 4-year-olds arrive, somebody coming from a nurturing home, I hesitate to use the word middle class, although I've used it in the text, a nurturing home, and it can be in any part of the social spectrum, that actually nurtures that child, that reads a story to it going to bed, that sees books in the hands of their parents, that sees people discoursing in a sophisticated and engaged way. The children of that household emerge at the gates of the school at 4 years of age, or the creche at 3 years of age, with a wonderfully enhanced vocabulary that leaves their cohorts behind them. And that gap the teachers then have to try and close. I believe that education in schools should not increase inequality, it should try and contain it, and if it can possibly reduce it. And I'm conscious of time, Don, so please, and I want to have a discussion, so just don't hesitate to give me the kick every so often, because you know me. Curriculum challenge. We have a wonderful primary education system. 1971 went away from the rote learning and the reading, and there are people here who know it better than I, because I'm an amateur, I'm not a professional educationist. So we have this wonderful exploratory, excite yourself to learn. And as Tom Collins, you mentioned him, at the IPPN, the Principals and Deputy Principals Conference that I first attended 3 years ago when I got this job, and he said something that still resonates with me. He said, I want to salute you as teachers, as principals, as deputy principals. And the names of McGahern and others come to mind, and all the stories of the horrors of the past. He said, you as a cohort of teachers in the last 20, 30 years have removed one fundamental thing that was deemed to be the constant in the childhood experience, and that was the fear of going to school. No primary child that I know now is fearful to go to school. They can't be held back. It's a place they love. Yet when they go to secondary school, and think of it, they're leaving a school of maybe 50, and we've 650 schools, or 20, out of the 3,200 that have less than 50 pupils in them around the country. When they move from that kind of intimate little family, and they're the big kids, they're 12, maybe 13, and like snakes and ladders, they've now gone from the top right down to the bottom, and they're in a big school surrounded by adults, maybe 600, 700, 800, up to 1,000. They're coping with everything. Now they're in a shopping mall of moving from one classroom to another. They're forgetting their books, they don't know their homework, they've lost their timetable, they've lost their jumper, and they're coping with puberty. One hell of a bag load to cope with. One hell of a bag load. And if they don't fully know how to read, and they're now in a situation where they have to read to learn, and they can't keep up with the reading in history, or this or that, by second year, they're in the departure lounge. They're waiting to leave. That's the reality of what we have today. And that's why I'm so committed to changing and reforming the secondary school curriculum. And I come back to it in detail if I may, but can I just mark it there? We have to change it. It will change. I've announced some of the changes already. But even with the passion that I have to change it, if I press the button next September, 12 months, the Leaving Cert kids who sit the reformed system won't do it until 2018. And we can't wait till 2018. So we're going to have to deal with some of the problems that Brian talked about. That's what, in a sense, is so important. The curriculum challenge has got to be changed in its structure. The third level works, although it's duplicative and inefficient. That's why you've been able to absorb so much. There's so much slack still in your system, and nobody knows about it. We have a higher education authority that negotiates with the third level sector. The Hunt report suggested it should be restructured and should have a more guiding directional role. Well, under my watch, it's going to get it. It's going to get it. It's going to get it within 2 years. And we're going to have the legislation. You're not going to like it. But Trinity College thought it was the end of civilization in 1998 when the Universities Act went through. And you'll learn to love it. You'll learn to love it. The third challenge we have is what I call the planning challenge. This is the architect, town planner, and me. I go into anywhere, I said, where are the exits, what have we got, what's the space, what's the rooms, where is it, how does it work, how does it interconnect, where's the plumbing, where's the electricity, what's the inventory of what we have. That's my way of thinking. We know feck all. I'm being polite. We know feck all about the inventory of our educational infrastructure. We have 3,200 primary schools, St. Bridget's, St. Pat's, St. Brendan's, and a roll number. The Gulag Archipelago couldn't have been as impersonal as identifying communities of learning as what they've done on Marlborough Street. When I asked the question of the 18 religious orders, what schools do they have and where they are? The department, I thought, as it turns out wrongly, I am being slowly house-trained, they didn't know because they couldn't find out. And why couldn't they find out? Because they had manual written files, 3,200 vertical silos, side by side, and nobody had done the horizontal correlation. So you could have St. Bridget's, roll number 1835S, and St. Pat's, roll number 19,000 and something else, and they were side by side. Was it on the church grounds or was it independent? They simply didn't know, and they don't know to this day. And that's the primary school system. The secondary school system, given the very subtle class system that we had in our educational system, where certain categories of nuns catered for certain classes of people. And there was a difference between the sisters and the mothers, and the mercy and the presentation, not to mention the Sacred Heart, who were as close to the Jesuits that it made no difference. And don't go near the tech. That was over there. We had our class system. Forget this nonsense that we weren't class-driven. And education was embedded around it. Incidentally, the condition of the introduction of the vocational education legislation in 1930, which the bishops said, we will agree to John Marcus O'Sullivan, whose uncle was a bishop in Kerry. Yes, we will allow you to introduce vocational education in this country on condition that the texts will not teach academic subjects. Now, if you want to look for apartheid, don't start with South Africa. Look at what we did here, where the working class children of this country were denied an academic door to their own personal liberation by a coterie of people, not because they were ideologically opposed to the faithful working class communities, but because they had private schools that were competing and charging fees, and they didn't want a free, state-subsidised system that would compete with the fee-paying schools, because in 1922 all secondary schools were fee-paying. The point I'm making before I get diverted is this. We need to take an inventory, since we have no money, because we've lost our economic sovereignty, and take any middle Irish town that you know of. Think any of it. There is what was the Tech. There is what was the Brothers. There is what was the Sisters. There is 3 or 4 primary schools. There's a sports hall here. There's a great French teacher there. There's a so-and-so here. There's a so-and-so there. There's a new building. There's an old building. We need an inventory of the educational infrastructure so that we can maximise its potential, so that we do get more with less. And we start with, A, finding out what we have, B, because they're all teaching the same curriculum now. All that class thing that I talked about is gone. It's all gone, thankfully. One phone call, Education Ennis. You got a problem, you ring Education Ennis. If you've got a problem with the university, you ring DCU. Who do you want to talk to? You're put through it. We have phone systems. We have teachers who are brilliant at French in one place. We have a science lab somewhere else. We could maximise the use of that if we knew what we had. We don't know what we have. We will in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, but it would be difficult to do. The technological challenge that you talked about, Brian. How am I doing, time-wise?
17 minutes.
Okay.
Keep
going.
Keep going.
Well, I've got 3 to do, and I'll do them very quickly. From the time of history, learning and teaching was an orally transmitted exchange. You know it from your Celtic studies here. Yes, there was writing in ancient Greece, and in ancient Ireland, incidentally, because our language and our written language is incredibly old. But it was written in a very confined way until the 1500s, when printing arrived in Europe. We didn't invent printing. We didn't invent it. The Chinese did. And in the 1500s, when Gutenberg actually discovered a mechanism whereby memory could be replaced by, and memory was the storage room of what you'd learned, and the oral tradition was the way in which it was conveyed, and the Socratic method of discourse was the way in which it was engaged upon. That was revolutionized by the fact that you had books, and people could afford books, so you didn't have to memorize. You could simply say, it's in the book. It's over there. We have now hit a new Gutenberg tipping moment, and that is the ICT. Looking back in history, it seems to have happened overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. These things don't happen overnight. But there are some tipping points. And I'll give you one technological one because I have an awful lot of them left. Old cassettes that have now been displaced by DVDs. There is a particular point in time when they stop producing cassettes. There's a particular point in time when the old technology is finally proclaimed dead. Now, we've used new technology. And I'll give you a very good example. Just hear this in your head. We have blackboards and chalk. When I started school in 1951, I literally had a slate, a piece of slate with a timber edge around it and a piece of chalk. That's how old I am. That system has now been replaced by a technology that has made it entirely redundant. And yet, the new technology, and you probably had to put your hand in your pocket for it, is called a whiteboard, not a blackboard. And why? Because we don't want to upset the teachers in the classroom to think that anything has changed. Nothing has changed. It's a bit like John Charles McQuaid coming back from Vatican II. Rest assured, nothing will disrupt or change our life experience. Blackboards have become whiteboards, but you guys are safe. And in the conferences that I've gone to, sponsored by all of these, they're producing teaching aids. In other words, don't frighten the horses. And until we embrace technology totally, we're not going to be able to liberalize ourselves. 2 last points. Investment The economic challenge and the international challenge. The economic challenge is not just about fees, Mary. It's about how much we want to make available into the education system. And incidentally, there's no such thing as free education. Ask any parent, ask any pupil. This coming September, pupils in the undergraduate level across the university sector will pay an increase of €500 on top of what their predecessors had to pay, which was €1,500, 2,000. Nice students, postgraduate students, a postgraduate degree in most of the universities is of the order of 4,000 or 5,000. And that's before you put in your hand in your pocket to have a cup of coffee or get there or anything else. That's just a charge. So there's no such thing about free education. And ask any parent, not about the price of the books, not about the price of the school trip, a transition year. Ask the parent in the 730 post-primary schools, less the 55 fee-paying schools, how much they pay in grinds to school teachers who actually make up for the gap between the good English school teacher at the end of the school and the bad English teacher at the other end of the school. €75 a week is the going rate for grinds. Delivered by who? Delivered by who? Teachers. Okay, let's put the elephant out in the room. And let's, put that out there as well. So we have to recognise that the cost of education is born. And yet what has happened, and I have the figures here, education currently gets 16% of the total budget. So you have been doing far more with less. It's an incredible feat. And an awful lot of it is not due to the slack that you have there, but you've actually been stacking them up. And I know that. In 1996, the similar take was 19%. Two things have happened. Health has gone from 21% to 25% in 2010, and social welfare, in fairness, largely got to do with the explosion in the unemployment level, has gone from 22% to 36%. So there has been that dislocation. We'll come back to that. Fees and loans. There is no system of loans for students. First of all, if you had a loan system which they would pay it back, assuming that they all stayed in Ireland and paid it back, it would be 17 years before it would be self-financing. So it is no solution to Brendan Howlin or Michael Noonan's problems. And I have a view, and you may want to discuss it, that if somebody like me or anybody else would introduce a student loan system, it would become the new emigrants tax. The illegals, the so-called undocumented in the United States, can't come home because they couldn't go back to the United States. They will become the new category of people who can't come home on me because I have to pay my student loan. And just you run that through your emotional system and figure it out. So yes, we have to invest. Yes, we have to find a way. Yes, we have to do it. Actually, I call it progressive income tax. You give somebody an education. You give somebody an education, they get a good job, they pay the going rate, progressive income tax. That's what it's called. But it's not as simple as that. And it is complex, and we do need to have a discussion, but let's put everything out on the table. Finally, and I will finally conclude on that, the internationalisation. There was talk, you talked about it, Brian, about our teachers and our quality of teachers. The great news is that we are getting into our training colleges, and I still call them training colleges, we train teachers, we educate people, but we train teachers because it's a skill. There is a skill associated with teaching. It's called pedagogy. And pedagogical skills, and incidentally lecturers should have it in third level as well. Nobody should get your job unless you can prove you can teach. So under the literacy and numeracy scheme that is going to cost on an annual recurring basis 19 million a year, which I'm finding within my budget, primary school teachers going to undergraduate school or colleges, and there's 5 of them, and the one that now gets to hire its graduates 50% is an online private college called Hibernia. So we're going to have to look at how you can get more with less there too. Primary school trainee teachers do 3 years. Under the new scheme, in 2 years' time, they do 4 years. And the 4th year will be in the classroom. And the second level teachers who went and did arts, in my day we used to call it the HDIP, and they ended up teaching. They're going to do 2 years before they qualify. And they won't any longer be a history teacher, for the reason that you stated. They will be a teacher in the secondary system with a trained qualification who has specialised in history, in that order. The day of the geography teacher, the history teacher, any of the others is gone. Secondary school teachers will be professional, trained teachers who have specialised in whatever. And that's where we will try and address some of the problems. And the last thing is the internationalisation. You talked about the new world. The students coming into your college green this coming autumn will be the first, in generational terms, of Western students who will confront a global horizon within which or upon which they can no longer presume to dominate the agenda. For those of you who know the name of Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of Great Nations, Imperial Overreach, written in 1986, if I recall correctly. When Columbus discovered, think of the European arrogance of this. The Incas have been there for centuries, and we discovered this place. It's like calling the First World War the First World War. It was a European civil war, and our colonies got involved. And we were involved in it. The arrogance, the assumed arrogance of Europeans, including the people of the Republic of Ireland, was built into us because we dominated the agenda for the previous 500 years, from the discovery of America and the expulsion of the Almoravids, the Moors, from the Iberian Peninsula. That day's gone. You talked about India. We know about China. But there are other places, Malaysia, Indonesia, a whole host of, who have the same hunger for progression and education and liberation that our parents and our grandparents had. So our young people are going to have to live in a world that they can no longer dominate, and they're going to have to live in a world where there are hungry competitors who are smart, if not smarter, with their own cultures and their own hunger that we had and which we have to rediscover. There's more I could say, there's more I would love to articulate. I have written the paper, it's available. Thank you very much indeed.